They laughed as she begged for fruit, but one human stepped in with compassion asterisk. The Phalenthi twin sons of Kepler were to be cast harsh shadows across the bustling marketplace of New Carthage, where the scent of exotic spices mingled with the acrid smell of poverty. Among the crowded stalls selling vibrant fruits and alien delicacies, a small figure moved like a ghost through the throngs of shoppers, ignored, despised, forgotten. Zareth pressed her back against the cool stone wall, her violet skin dulled by malnutrition and her once proud cranial ridges now barely visible beneath matted hair. The Velthari had once been warriors among the stars, their ships cutting through space like silver arrows, their honor songs echoing across a dozen worlds. Now, 3 years after the Treaty of Broken Suns, they were nothing more than refugees clinging to the edges of civilization. Her stomach cramped with familiar hunger as she watched a fruit vendor arrange his wares, golden pelta fruits that glowed like small suns, their sweet nectar a delicacy she remembered from childhood. Before the war, before the fall, before her people became a cautionary tale whispered in diplomatic circles. Please, she whispered in broken standard, approaching the stall with trembling hands. Just one? The ones that fall. The vendor, a portly Terran with graying hair, looked up from his display with disgust. Get away from here, Ridgehead. Your kind brings nothing but trouble. Laughter erupted from nearby shoppers, a cruel symphony that followed her everywhere. A well-dressed human woman pointed at Zareth's ragged clothes, whispering something to her companion that made them both snicker. A group of teenage colonists began making mock warrior poses, their voices rising in a sardonic imitation of ancient Velthari battle cries. Look at the mighty warrior now, one of them called out, begging for scraps like a common scavenger. Zareth's cheeks burned with shame, but she couldn't leave, not yet. Her younger brother Keth waited in their makeshift shelter, too weak to walk, surviving on the thin broth she managed to scrounge each day. The memory of his fevered eyes gave her strength to endure the humiliation. I have credits, she lied, knowing her empty pockets held nothing but lint and broken dreams. Please, just one small fruit. The vendor's face reddened. I said get lost. He grabbed a rotten pelta from beneath his counter and hurled it at her feet, where it splattered across the market stones. There's your fruit, savage. The crowds. Laughter grew louder, more vicious. Someone threw a small stone that struck her shoulder. Another vendor joined in, tossing spoiled vegetables that left stains on her already dirty clothes. The mob mentality was infectious, spreading like wildfire through the marketplace. Zareth stumbled backward, her vision blurring from hunger and tears she refused to shed. The familiar weight of defeat settled on her shoulders, the same feeling that had crushed her people when their fleet burned in the darkness between stars. She had survived the war, escaped the camps, crossed half the galaxy searching for sanctuary, only to find that hatred followed them everywhere. As the jeering crowd pressed closer, something inside her began to break, not her spirit that had been tested by flames far hotter than these colonial bullies could kindle, but her hope, the fragile belief that somewhere in this vast universe, someone might see past the propaganda and recognize the person beneath the despised skin. She turned to leave, each step heavier than the last, when she noticed him watching from across the marketplace. A young human man in diplomatic blues, his dark eyes filled not with disgust or amusement, but with something she hadn't seen directed at her people in years, compassion. Their gazes met across the sea of hatred, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. The laughter faded to background noise, the cruel words became distant echoes. In his eyes, she saw not a monster or a defeated enemy, but simply another soul struggling to find its place in an unforgiving world. Then the moment shattered as the crowd surged forward, and Zareth found herself running once again, her feet carrying her through the winding alleys of the refugee district, where even hope came at too high a price. The witness diplomatic attaché Kai Yoshimura had witnessed many injustices during his training rotation on the Outer Rim worlds, but nothing had prepared him for the raw cruelty displayed in New Carthage's marketplace. The scene replayed in his mind as he stood in his quarters that evening, staring out at the city's glittering lights, while the memory of violet skin and haunted eyes refused to fade. His datapad chimed with another message from his mentor, Ambassador Reginald Thornton, reminding him of tomorrow's cultural sensitivity briefing. The irony wasn't lost on him learning about interspecies relations, while watching a young Velthari girl get pelted with rotten fruit for the crime of being hungry. Kai had grown up on Earth's diplomatic quarter, where his Japanese mother and Irish father had raised him on stories of cooperation and unity among the stars. His parents had met during the early days of the Galactic Alliance, when humanity was still wide-eyed and optimistic about their place in the cosmic community. Those ideals had shaped his decision to join the diplomatic corps, but 3 months on Kepler-4 had shown him how far reality fell short of those lofty principles. The Velthari refugees weren't the first displaced people he'd encountered. The galaxy was full of the dispossessed species that had chosen the wrong side in conflicts, or simply been in the wrong place when borders shifted. But there was something different about the systematic dehumanization he'd witnessed today. The casual cruelty, the way even children joined in the torment. He pulled up the classified files on his personal reader, accessing information that painted a picture far more complex than the public narrative. The Velthari hadn't been the aggressors. In the War of Broken Suns, they'd been defending their homeworld from consortium expansion. Their defeat had been more political than military, engineered by corporations that wanted access to their mineral-rich systems. The girl from the marketplace couldn't have been more than 20 standard years old, too young to have fought in the war, too young to bear the weight of her people's collective punishment. Yet she carried it anyway, in the hunch of her shoulders and the careful way she moved through crowds, always ready to run. Kai closed the files and made a decision that would have horrified his superiors. He changed out of his diplomatic uniform and into civilian clothes, then made his way back to the marketplace district. The vendors were closing their stalls, but a few remained open for the late evening crowd. He found the same fruit vendor from earlier, the man who'd thrown the rotten pelta. The portly Terran was counting his day's earnings with obvious satisfaction. "Excuse me," Kai said, approaching the stall. "I'd like to buy some fruit." The vendor looked up, his demeanor instantly shifting to the obsequious friendliness reserved for paying customers. "Of course, sir. What can I get you?" "Fresh pelta fruits. Just arrived from the hydroponic farms, sweet as sunshine. I promise, I'll take 5 bags. Kai said, watching the man's eyes widen with greed. "The best you have." As the vendor eagerly filled the bags with the finest specimens, Kai found himself thinking about the look in the girl's eyes when their gazes had met. Not just hunger or desperation, but a flicker of something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just surprise at seeing a human who looked at her as if she mattered. "That'll be 80 credits, the vendor announced, practically rubbing his hands together with glee. Kai paid without haggling, then hefted the bags. "Tell me something. That Velthari girl who was here earlier, do you see her often?" The vendor's expression soured. "Too often, if you ask me. They're like vermin, these ridgeheads. Give them a handout once, and they'll never leave you alone." "Where do they live?" Kai asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Down in the hollow, past the industrial sector. But I wouldn't recommend going there. Sir, not safe for decent folk." Kai nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, you might want to consider that your ridgehead problem could be solved by showing a little basic decency. They're people, not vermin." He walked away before the vendor could respond, the bags of fruit weighing heavy in his arms. The night air was cool against his face as he made his way toward the industrial sector, following the directions to a place called the Hollow, where hope went to die. The farther he walked from the city center, the more the gleaming facade of New Carthage began to crumble. Broken streetlights cast uneven shadows, and the smell of industrial waste grew stronger with each step. By the time he reached the refugee district, he was walking through a maze of improvised shelters built from shipping containers and scrap metal. Somewhere in this labyrinth of desperation, a girl with violet skin was probably going to bed hungry. But not tonight. Tonight, she would have fruit. The Gift Hollow lived up to its name, a depression in the landscape, where the city's unwanted had carved out an existence from society's discarded remnants. Makeshift dwellings constructed from corrugated metal and recycled plastic stretched as far as Kai could see, connected by narrow paths that wound between them like arteries in a broken heart. The air was thick with the smell of cooking fires and industrial runoff, punctuated by the distant hum of the city's fusion generators. Children's voices echoed between the structures, speaking in the lilting tones of a dozen different languages, refugees from conflicts scattered across the galaxy, all seeking the same elusive dream of safety. Kai clutched the bags of fruit tighter as he navigated the maze of shelters, drawing curious stares from the inhabitants. His clean clothes and obvious health marked him as an outsider, someone who belonged to the world above. A few residents retreated into their homes at his approach, while others watched him with the wary calculation of those who had learned to expect the worst from strangers. He was beginning to wonder if he'd ever find her when he heard a familiar voice speaking in rapid Velthari. The words were foreign to him, but the tone was unmistakable, someone trying to comfort another person in pain. Following the sound, he found himself standing before a shelter constructed from two shipping containers, welded together, their sides painted with faded murals depicting what might have been scenes from the Velthari homeworld. Through a gap in the metal sheets that served as a door, he could see the girl from the marketplace kneeling beside a makeshift bed. Zareth was spooning thin broth into the mouth of a younger male, who bore a strong resemblance to her, the same violet skin and cranial ridges, though his were more pronounced despite his obvious youth. Her brother, Kai realized. The boy appeared to be in the grip of fever, his breathing shallow and labored. "Keth, please," she whispered in standard, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "Just a little more. You need to keep your strength up." The boy Keth turned his head away weakly. "I'm not hungry, sister. Save it for yourself. Don't be foolish," she replied, though her own frame spoke of months of self-imposed starvation. "You're going to get better. The fever will break soon." Kai stood frozen in the doorway, witnessing an intimate moment of love and desperation. The girl who had been humiliated in the marketplace was now the picture of gentle strength, caring for her brother with a tenderness that made his chest tight. Her hands, though thin and scarred, moved with practiced efficiency as she adjusted the boy's blankets and checked his temperature. He cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle them. Zareth's head snapped up, her hand instinctively moving to a crude knife at her belt, a warrior's reflex that even hunger and defeat couldn't fully suppress. "I'm sorry," Kai said quickly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I didn't mean to intrude. I saw what happened in the marketplace today." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You're the human who was watching." It wasn't a question. "What do you want?" "I brought food," he said simply, holding up the bags. "Real food. Fresh fruit." The skepticism in her expression deepened. Why? It was such a simple question, but Kai found himself struggling to answer. Why had he come here? Because he was appalled by the cruelty he'd witnessed? Because his diplomatic training told him this was a humanitarian crisis? Because he couldn't get the image of her haunted eyes out of his mind? Because it was the right thing to do, he said finally. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. "Nothing is free in this place. What's the price?" "No price. No conditions." He set the bags down just inside the entrance. "I'll leave them here and go, if that makes you more comfortable." But as he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Wait." When he looked back, she was standing, her posture straighter than he'd seen in the marketplace. For a moment, he glimpsed the warrior heritage that flowed in her blood, the pride that adversity had bent, but not broken. "What's your name?" she asked. "Kaio Shimura." "And yours?" "Zareth." "This is my brother, Keth." She gestured to the boy, who was watching the exchange with fevered curiosity. "Why are you really here, Kaio Shimura?" He considered lying, giving her some diplomatic answer about humanitarian duty or interspecies cooperation. Instead, he chose honesty. "Because seeing you treated like that made me angry. Because my parents raised me to believe that how we treat the powerless defines who we are as people. Because I looked into your eyes today and saw someone who deserved better than the cruelty this world has shown you." Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor of suspicion that had protected her through years of disappointment. "You speak like a diplomat." "I am a diplomat, or trying to be one." "Then you should leave." The walls went back up, but he could see the effort it took. Associating with my kind won't help your career. Let me worry about my career." He gestured to the bags of fruit. "Will you at least take the food? For your brother, if not for yourself." She hesitated, pride warring with desperation. Finally, desperation won. She knelt and opened one of the bags, revealing perfect pelt of fruits that glowed like captured starlight. Her breath caught in her throat. "I haven't seen fruit this fresh since," she trailed off. "Lost in memory. Since before the war." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Behind her, Keth had struggled to sit up, his eyes wide with wonder at the sight of real food. "Sister," he whispered, "are those really pelta fruits?" "Yes, little warrior," she replied, using what Kai guessed was a childhood endearment. "Real pelta fruits." She looked up at Kai, and for the first time, her expression held something other than suspicion or defeat. "Thank you." The simple words carried the weight of hope, fragile and new, but real. As Kai watched her carefully select a fruit for her brother, he realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. What had begun as an impulse born of outrage was becoming something deeper, something that might, with time and care, grow into trust. The ripple news traveled fast in the hollow, carried on whispers and shared glances that spoke volumes about the residents' well-practiced survival instincts. Within days of Kai's visit, the entire refugee district buzzed with the story of the human diplomat who had brought food to the Velthari siblings without asking for anything in return. Zareth found herself at the center of unwanted attention, as neighbors she barely knew approached her with questions. Was it true? Had a human really shown kindness to her family? What did he want? When would he return? She answered their queries with characteristic bluntness, but privately, she was asking herself the same questions. 5 days had passed since Kai's unexpected visit, and Keth's fever had finally broken thanks to proper nutrition. The boy was sitting up now, able to take solid food, his natural curiosity returning as his strength grew. "Tell me again about the human," he said, carefully peeling another pelt of fruit with hands that were no longer trembling. "What did he look like?" "Tall for a human," Zareth replied, watching her brother eat with satisfaction. "Dark hair, kind eyes. He wore civilian clothes, but he moved like someone used to authority. And he just gave us the food. Nothing in return, nothing." She still could hardly believe it herself. In 3 years of refugee life, every act of apparent kindness had come with strings attached: food for information, shelter for labor, safety for silence. But Kai had simply left 5 bags of the finest fruit she'd ever seen and walked away. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Voices were raised in what sounded like an argument, followed by the distinctive sound of someone being shoved. Zareth grabbed her knife and moved to the entrance, peering through the gap in the metal sheeting. A crowd had gathered around their shelter, and at its center stood Kai, flanked by 2 uniformed colonial security officers. Her heart sank as she recognized the scene. Another raid, another excuse to harass the refugees. But something was different this time. Kai wasn't participating in the harassment. He was arguing with the officers. "This is completely unnecessary," he was saying, his diplomatic composure strained but intact. "These people aren't criminals, sir. With respect, you don't understand the situation here," replied the senior officer, a woman with sergeant's stripes and cold eyes. "The ridge heads are getting ideas above their station. Someone's been encouraging them, telling them they deserve better treatment." "Maybe they do deserve better treatment." The sergeant's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We have reports of seditious activity in this sector." "Seditious activity?" Kai's voice rose. "What seditious activity?" "Accepting charity, feeding sick children." Zareth's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Someone had reported Kai's visit, probably spinning it as something more dangerous than simple compassion. In the paranoid atmosphere of the colony, any change in the refugees' behavior was seen as a potential threat. She was about to retreat deeper into the shelter when Kai's eyes found hers. Through the gap, for a moment, their gazes locked, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart race, not fear or regret, but determination. "Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his diplomatic status, I am formally invoking my right to observe this operation under colonial regulation for 7B. Any action taken against these civilians will be documented in my official report to the Alliance. Council. The sergeant's face flushed with anger. You're making a mistake, sir. These aren't your people. They're not your enemy either. Kai stepped forward, placing himself between the officers and the crowd of refugees who had gathered to watch the confrontation, their families trying to survive in a world that sees them as less than human. If that's seditious, then maybe the sedition is justified. A murmur ran through the crowd. Humans and aliens alike were staring at the young diplomat, with expressions ranging from shock to admiration. In the rigid hierarchy of colonial society, no one challenged the security forces. No one stood up for the refugees. No one put their career on the line for the sake of principle. No one except Kai Yoshimura. The sergeant looked like she wanted to arrest him on the spot, but his diplomatic immunity created a legal minefield she wasn't prepared to navigate. After a tense moment, she stepped back. This isn't over, she warned. The colonial administration will hear about this. I'm counting on it, Kai replied. As the security officers retreated, the crowd of refugees began to disperse, but their excited chatter continued. Zareth could hear them discussing what they'd witnessed, their voices carrying a note she hadn't heard in years. Hope. She stepped outside, approaching Kai as he straightened his clothes and tried to restore his diplomatic composure. Up close, she could see the fine tremor in his hands that betrayed his nervous energy. You shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Probably not, he agreed. But I couldn't stand there and watch them intimidate you because someone showed you basic human decency. They'll make trouble for you now. Let them try. He met her eyes, and she saw that the kindness she'd glimpsed in the marketplace had been tempered by something harder. I didn't come to this world to watch injustice flourish in silence. Around them, the residents of the Hollow were still watching, still whispering among themselves. Word of what had happened would spread beyond the refugee district, carrying news of the human diplomat who had chosen compassion over caution. Neither Kai nor Zareth fully realized it yet, but they had just lit a fuse that would burn far beyond the confines of New Carthage. Sometimes the smallest acts of defiance become the seeds of revolution, and the galaxy was about to learn that courage, like hope, was contagious. What happens now? She asked. Now, Kai said, looking out over the maze of makeshift shelters with new resolve, we find out how many people are willing to stand up and be counted. The awakening 3 weeks after the confrontation with colonial security. The ripples of change had spread far beyond the Hollow. Kai found himself at the center of a growing storm as his report to the Alliance Council sparked debates in chambers. Across the galaxy, the document, officially titled A Study in Colonial Administration, Human Rights Violations on Kepler-4 had been leaked to the press and was making waves in diplomatic circles. Ambassador Thornton paced behind his desk like a caged predator, his usual composure shattered by the political firestorm engulfing his mission. Do you have any idea what you've done, Yoshimura? The colonial authority is calling for your immediate recall. The consortium is threatening to withdraw their mining contracts. The governor wants you declared persona non grata. Kai sat in the uncomfortable chair across from his mentor, his hands folded calmly in his lap despite the career-ending implications of the conversation. I documented violations of Alliance Charter principles, sir. That's exactly what a diplomatic observer is supposed to do. You've turned a routine cultural exchange into an interplanetary incident. Thornton slammed his palm on the desk. The Velthari situation is a settled matter. They lost the war, accepted the terms of surrender, and agreed to relocate. End of story. Respectfully, sir, it's not the end of their story. It's barely the beginning. Through the windows of the embassy, Kai could see the city of New Carthage sprawling in the distance, its gleaming towers built on foundations of inequality and injustice. Somewhere in that urban maze, Zareth was probably working in one of the factories that had recently begun hiring refugees, a small concession wrung from the colonial government by the growing media attention. The changes had been gradual but noticeable. More shops were serving Velthari customers. A free clinic had opened in the industrial district. Most importantly, The random harassment by security forces had decreased significantly under the scrutiny of off-world observers who had arrived in the wake of Kai's report. "There's something else," Thornton said, his voice dropping to a more personal register. "The girl you've been helping, Zaret H. Intelligence reports suggest she's become something of a folk hero. Among the refugees, they're calling her the voice of the hollow." Kai's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen Zareth in person for over a week, but he'd heard rumors of her growing influence. Refugees from other districts were making pilgrimages to hear her speak about dignity and hope. Her brother Keth had started teaching other children to read, using donated materials that somehow kept finding their way to the hollow. "Is that a problem?" Kai asked carefully. "It is if she starts pushing for political changes the colonial government isn't ready to accept." Thornton moved to the window, staring out at the city. "There are forces at work here bigger than both of you. Understand, the consortium has invested billions in the mineral rights on this world. The governor's political future depends on maintaining stability. Push too hard, too fast, and people get hurt. People are already getting hurt. They've been getting hurt for 3 years, and dramatic change could make it worse." Thornton turned back to face him. "I'm ordering you to cease all contact with the refugee population. Consider it a direct command." Kai felt something crystallize in his chest, a clarity that had been building since that first day in the marketplace. "Then I'll have to respectfully decline that order. Sir, excuse me. I resign from the diplomatic corps, effective immediately." Kai stood, pulling out his identification badge and placing it on the desk. "I can't serve an organization that prioritizes political convenience over basic human rights." Thornton stared at him in shock. "You're throwing away your entire career for a lost cause. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally finding a cause worth fighting for." An hour later, Kai walked through the gates of the hollow carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a sense of purpose that felt stronger than any career ambition he'd ever experienced. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and by the time he reached the center of the refugee district, a small crowd had gathered. Zareth emerged from the crowd, her violet skin glowing with health that proper nutrition had restored. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by something fierce and determined, the look of someone who had remembered how to fight. "I heard what you did," she said simply. "What we did," he corrected. "This started with both of us." She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and the crowd around them began to cheer. Not the mocking laughter he remembered from the marketplace, but the sound of hope taking root in barren soil. "So what happens now?" she asked, echoing the question she'd posed weeks earlier. Kai looked around at the faces surrounding them, humans and aliens, young and old, all united by a shared belief that change was possible. In the distance, he could see news drones hovering over the district, broadcasting their story to worlds across the galaxy. "Now we prove that sometimes the smallest kindness can change an entire universe," he said, as the crowd surged around them. Kai and Zareth found themselves standing closer together, their hands almost touching. The gesture was small, barely noticeable among the celebration, but it carried the weight of a promise. They had started this journey as strangers from different worlds, brought together by a moment of compassion over discarded fruit. Now they stood as partners in a movement that was spreading beyond the borders of New Carthage, beyond the atmosphere of Kepler-4 to be, into the vast network of worlds where the dispossessed and forgotten were watching with growing hope. The revolution had begun with a single act of kindness. Where it would end, neither of them could say, but they would face that uncertain future together, two souls who had found in each other not just love, but purpose. And in the hollow, where hope had once gone to die, children played in the streets while their parents planned a better tomorrow.